City of Canals, a memoir to the other world. It was July of 2006. I was still a young man then. I had just parted ways with my mother and sister after we had spent several weeks traveling across Europe together. I met them in Paris, France, where I had arrived solo from Italy. We rented a car and made the chaotic drive north through Brussels, Belgium, where we ate delicious waffles and gourmet filet of kangaroo, before finally ending in Amsterdam, Holland. Of all the European cities I visited, Amsterdam was the one I had looked forward to the most. After a few days together, my family departed for home. I stayed behind for a couple more days in a youth hostel whose name I can no longer remember. It was one of those places full of worn-out couches, battered backpacks, young travelers drifting in and out, water pipes decorating the coffee tables like flower vases, and the unmistakable aroma of espresso, fresh-baked croissants, and ganja smoke hanging in the air. To this day, that scent instantly carries me back to Amsterdam, the great city of canals. It was there that I met another young traveler about my age. He spoke American English, which immediately stood out amongst the myriad of foreign languages filling the room. I introduced myself by joining his conversation. He was from Chicago, Illinois, and sat comfortably in the common room smoking hashish as though he had nowhere else in the world to be. We struck up a conversation, and before long, we found ourselves discussing magic mushrooms, the famous psilocybin cubensis. I told him about one of Amsterdam's legendary smart shops where psychedelic mushrooms and various other psychoactive herbs could still be legally purchased. It didn't take much convincing. Within a few minutes, we had both agreed it sounded like the most reasonable thing to do. Why not have ourselves a proper psychotropic Dutch breakfast? So we set off. We walked along the broad canals beneath rows of leaning Dutch townhouses, their narrow brick facades reflected in the dark water below as the morning sun had yet to illuminate their mysterious character. Countless bicycles rattled across the cobblestones, bells ringing as riders effortlessly slipped past one another, while the morning parade of pedestrians and cyclists flowed through the streets. Houseboats floated lazily beside the embankments. Flower boxes spilled over windowsills and inside wooden-barreled garden pots with the bright-colored blooms of the summer's variety tucked neatly between centuries-old buildings. And I remember furry cats of every shape and size everywhere, lounging in windows, wandering the sidewalks, behaving as though the entire city belonged to them. Eventually, we arrived at the smart shop. Its name was Tatanka, the Lakota word for the great American bison, also known as the buffalo. Inside, I was amazed by the selection. Shelves were lined with strange herbs, cacti, powders, extracts, and neatly packaged mushrooms, each promising its own distinct journey into what mystics and shamans had, in one form or another, called the other world for thousands of years. After carefully examining our options, we settled on a strain of psilocybin cubensis known as Golden Teacher. According to the label, it was considered high strength. That sounded more like a personal invitation than a warning to two young, daring men in the prime of their restless youth. We legally purchased our mushrooms and headed back toward the hostel. Along the way, we stopped for what seemed, at least to my younger self, like another essential part of a proper mushroom breakfast. Not eggs and biscuits, beer. A cold pint of Heineken. After all, what psychedelic breakfast was complete without an ice-cold beer on an empty stomach? Back at the hostel, we settled once again onto the old, familiar couches in the common room. By now, the place had filled with travelers from every corner of Europe and beyond. Languages blended together into one constant murmur, while backpacks piled against the walls and coffee cups clattered across wooden tables in anticipation of whatever adventures the day might bring. We opened our box of golden teachers. Without much ceremony or deliberation, we ate them, chasing each mouthful with long swallows of cold Heineken. It was a memorable culinary harmony. Nearby sat two young British backpackers who watched us with expressions somewhere between horror and amusement. "Bloody hell," one of them laughed. "That's disgusting, isn't it?" I looked over at them. "Oh, you Brits are always so bloody proper and aloof, aren't you?" I replied in the most exaggerated fake British accent I could manage. "Oh, bollocks to you." Years of watching Monty Python and British films had apparently paid off. The room erupted in laughter, including my partner in crime beside me. The two Englishmen frowned, thoroughly unamused, shook their heads, and wisely decided to leave it there. It was hardly my most mature moment. Then again, at 23 years old, maturity wasn't exactly my prerogative. About 20 minutes passed. Neither of us felt much of anything. Then we looked at one another with the same realization. This is probably going to kick in soon. If we're going to need supplies, we'd better get them now. It suddenly seemed like the most rational idea in the world. Once the mushrooms took hold, who knew what state of mind we'd be in? Buying snacks, or even navigating a grocery store, might soon become an impossible expedition. The race was on. Out we hurried once again into the streets of Amsterdam, weaving past bicycles, canals, and rows of crooked brick houses beneath the warm summer sun, making our way toward the nearest little neighborhood grocery store before reality itself decided to become negotiable. The little grocery store looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Inside, it was another universe. Now, mind you, I spoke only English. Walking into that Dutch grocery store might as well have been like wandering into some wet market in the middle of downtown China. Every package, every label, every sign hanging from the ceiling was completely foreign to me. I couldn't read a single thing. Even sober, or now semi-sober, many of the products already looked strange and unfamiliar. We wandered through the aisles, searching for something that vaguely resembled food. Then I felt it, that unmistakable sensation I had experienced before, the first wave. It was subtle at first, like a small ripple spreading across a still lake. The air seemed lighter, colors became just a little richer. My body felt unusually relaxed, while my mind became strangely alert. Sounds became sharper. Another 10 minutes of perusing passed. Things were becoming peculiar. The brightly colored plastic packages lining the shelves no longer looked like ordinary groceries. They looked like props from some alien civilization or souvenirs from Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Every aisle seemed stranger than the last. We found ourselves stopping to stare at random products simply because they perplexed us, studying them like amateur archaeologists examining remnants of some forgotten civilization. What exactly were these things? Who bought them? Why did they look so preposterous? The questions themselves became hysterically funny. We laughed harder than the situation deserved. It was impossible not to. Despite having absolutely no idea what half the food actually was, we gathered whatever vaguely resembled snacks. We weren't hungry, far from it, but it somehow seemed like an excellent idea to prepare for whatever voyage our minds were about to undertake. Eventually, we reached the checkout. The cashier looked at us politely, though with a skeptical expression, while we struggled to maintain even the slightest appearance of composure. Every attempt to act normal only made the situation funnier and more impossible. Somehow, through barely suppressed laughter and what I can only assume was terrible communication, we completed the transaction and hurriedly escaped back into the streets. Amsterdam was no longer the same city. The cobblestones beneath my feet had begun to flow like large, irregular pebbles floating upon a lake of water, as though they themselves had become another canal. The old Dutch buildings, already famous for their gentle leaning, slowly began to sway toward one another in graceful rhythm, breathing almost imperceptibly like great living giants. Their narrow windows stretched and relaxed while sunlight shimmered across centuries of weathered brickwork. The entire city had taken on the appearance of a Van Gogh painting. The canals reflected impossible colors, vivid, vibrant. The leaves of the trees shimmered with a strange inner life as they waltzed playfully in the cool breeze. Window boxes overflowing with geraniums and daffodils glowed with impossible saturation, while rows of bright roses and lilies seemed almost too beautiful to belong to the ordinary world. A herd of cats continued their aristocratic parade among the plebeians, for whom they were far too indifferent to notice, while bicycles glided effortlessly past us, leaving faint trails of luminance. There was no paranoia, no fear, only fascination, only awe. Everything felt profoundly alive. For the next couple of hours, we wandered aimlessly through the city, laughing at almost everything as the intensity of the experience steadily increased, walking with that unmistakable psychedelic gait as we tried to balance ourselves upon what felt like malleable streets of warm clay. Every corner revealed another beautiful canal, another crooked row of narrow houses reflected perfectly in the water below, another bridge crossing into what felt like an entirely different dimension. Eventually, the constant walking caught up with us. We found a curb beside one of the canals and sat down to rest. By now, the experience had reached its apex. The buildings no longer simply leaned. They melted into one another, like wet paint on canvas, swaying back and forth in rhythmic dance to some unseen big band. The green vines climbing the trees had become slithering serpents with feathered wings branching outward in some Assyrian fashion. The flowers in the garden beds became arms raised toward the blazing sun above, shouting for joy and singing songs of praise like something from Alice in Wonderland. Houseboats slowly morphed before my eyes, ballooning into fluid forms. People passing by stretched, compressed, and flowed into impossible proportions before effortlessly returning to normal again. It all became an orgasmic symphony of sensory stimulation, a bizarre geometric matrix of phantasmagoria dancing gracefully in synchronicity, yet wildly before my flabbergasted eyes. What words could I possibly find? Language itself had begun to dissolve. I would begin speaking a sentence only to completely forget what words were halfway through it. I'd trail off into silence, overwhelmed not by confusion, but by pure astonishment. Words no longer seemed very important. Everything had become visual. Everything had become sensation. Colors exploded with impossible brilliance. Shapes expanded, contracted, breathed, and folded into themselves. Sounds seemed to acquire texture and color, while colors somehow carried sounds of their own. My senses no longer operated separately. They merged into one continuous stream of perception, a psychedelic continuum. This was no longer merely being high. This was the other world, the ancient realm spoken of by countless shamans, mystics, and those who had spent thousands of years searching for the sacred hidden behind the ordinary. Then suddenly, two police officers slowly crossed our line of sight. In my mind, they looked like British constables from 2 centuries earlier, complete with tall helmets, heavy coats, and dangling billy clubs upon their hips, marching with exaggerated goose steps as though they had wandered out of some cartoon from another century. They glanced toward us. My pupils were probably, to them, the size of dinner plates. They simply smiled. One pointed in our direction. They knew. Without saying a word, they knew exactly what state we were in, as they chuckled and murmured to themselves before continuing on their way. I couldn't help thinking how different this exact moment would have been back home in the United States. Had this been America, especially America of the 1960s, would those clubs have been used on us instead? Would I have been arrested, interrogated, punished for the terrible crime of attempting to discover my own mind, for exploring my own birthright, my consciousness? The thought struck me with stunning force. What if the greatest sin wasn't eating the so-called forbidden fruit? What if the greatest sin was discovering that it had been forbidden in the first place? As I sat there watching the city breathe, another thought quietly crept into my mind. What if this was the forbidden fruit? Not in the childish sense I had been taught growing up, based upon some tired Abrahamic tale with puritanical overtones, but in the oldest, most archaic mythological sense imaginable. Here I was, having willingly eaten the so-called flesh of the gods, taking part in what felt far less like recreational drug use and more like some forgotten initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. I had dared, if only for a few hours, to sit before the oracle at Delphi and ask questions that ordinary consciousness rarely allows itself to ask. The walls separating me from the world were dissolving. The boundary between myself and everything around me no longer seemed so absolute. I wasn't simply looking at nature. I was inside it. I was it. Communicating with Gaia herself, with Mother Earth, or with whatever divine intelligence so clearly, yet so elusively, permeates while simultaneously transcending the very fabric of this existence we call life. While I had grown up within a traditional, loving, and casual Catholic upbringing, and was educated through school curriculums produced for the masses that insisted the known universe was little more than a dead mechanical accident, here I was experiencing something that refused to fit neatly inside those tidy little boxes that had been constructed for us. We were taught that everything could ultimately be reduced to chemistry, physics, blind evolutionary processes, and endless chains of cause and effect. Nature, according to that unimaginative worldview, possessed no inherent meaning beyond survival and reproduction. Consciousness itself was little more than neurons firing inside an accidental brain, an interesting mistake. Yet here I was, experiencing something that refused to fit inside those same tidy little boxes. Everything now appeared profoundly interconnected, alive, sacred. The reductionist machinery of modern materialism, more than ever before, felt astonishingly small compared to the overwhelming immediacy of lived experience itself. Perhaps consciousness was not merely a byproduct of the universe. Perhaps consciousness was woven into its very fabric. Perhaps it was primary. I wasn't interested in proving anything beyond myself. I simply couldn't deny what I was experiencing. For one brief afternoon, the walls had come down. The curtain had been drawn back, and there sat the little man pulling his silly levers, desperately instructing everyone not to notice that the emperor had no clothes. The categories had all melted away. The endless labels, definitions, and compartments that our modern industrial civilization had spent centuries constructing and spoon-feeding to its multitude of serfs had simply disappeared. Money, status, politics, career, consumerism, all of it seemed strangely theatrical, like elaborate stage props existing only because everyone silently agreed to continue pretending they were real. Meanwhile, the canals continued flowing exactly as they always had, the timeless flow of water. The trees continued growing, breathing life itself. The lazy cats continued wandering the avenues and alleyways with complete apathy toward humanity's endless obsession with progress. Nature carried on without asking permission from our civilization of entitled, tech-savvy Homo sapiens. And then I smiled. Not because I had discovered some ultimate truth, but because I had remembered something ancient that modern life constantly encourages us to forget. I looked around at Amsterdam. Never mind visiting the Van Gogh Museum. I was inside the painting. The entire city had become living oil upon canvas. Thick, impressionistic brushstrokes shimmered beneath the afternoon light. Every reflection dancing across the canals appeared freshly painted before dissolving once more into water. The crooked houses leaned together like old friends, whispering esoteric secrets, while the canals mirrored a world that somehow seemed even more real than the one above them. Time itself had become meaningless. Perhaps an hour had passed, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps both. Psychedelics have an extraordinary way of dismantling our ordinary relationship with time and space until both become little more than convenient habits of consciousness. Gradually, I felt my thoughts beginning to organize themselves again. The visual distortions remained, but something had shifted. The overwhelming flood of sensation slowly gave way to an extraordinary clarity. It was as though my notion of self, that familiar voice constantly narrating ordinary life, had quietly returned after briefly stepping aside on holiday. The experience was still intensely psychedelic, but now my mind felt almost impossibly sharp, focused, precise. My thoughts moved like a laser beam. The strange thing about mushrooms is that once the peak begins to soften, the world often appears not less meaningful, but infinitely more meaningful. Every conversation, every face, every building, every passing thought seemed connected by invisible threads patiently waiting to be noticed. We continued walking through the city. Eventually, we came across a coffee shop unlike any I had ever seen. Above the entrance hung the unmistakable name, The Doors. I had long been a devoted admirer of the legendary rock band. Jim Morrison's haunting, soulful voice, Ray Manzarek's hypnotic keyboard melodies, Robbie Krieger's ethereal guitar, and John Densmore's Latin jazz-infused drumming. It was music to my soul. We stepped inside. It felt as though someone had built the place specifically for people in our condition. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with enormous painted murals of Jim Morrison staring down from every direction with those mystical eyes. Psychedelic artwork and music memorabilia hung awkwardly across the exposed oak beam ceilings. The speakers filled the room with the unmistakable sound of late 1960s acid rock. I had wandered into psychedelic heaven. There was a pool table near the back. My American companion, whose name I honestly can't remember and perhaps never really knew, was happily chewing on some hash edible while saying something I no longer recall. I looked over at him. "We should play pool." It seemed like the greatest idea either of us had ever had. The billiards table was already occupied by two Dutch lads about our age who spoke some English. They were simply enjoying a few afternoon pints, completely unaware that two Americans had wandered in from another dimension. We asked if they wanted a game of 8-ball. They smiled. Why not? What happened next still surprises me when I think back on it. Although the room continued to shimmer with surreal color and the walls still breathed ever so slightly, my mind had become amazingly precise. Every angle on the table revealed itself almost instinctively. The geometry wasn't something I consciously calculated. It simply presented itself. The lines between each ball seemed obvious and natural, as though the table itself were quietly suggesting every shot before I ever took it. There was almost no thought involved, only action. Stroke after stroke found its mark, and my partner in crime was no different. He played beautifully, and together we won game after game. I remember being genuinely puzzled. How could a mind so visually overwhelmed simultaneously become so mechanically accurate? Even then, I realized I had learned something profound about consciousness. The mind is capable of extraordinary things when freed, however briefly, from its ordinary habits. Perhaps it wasn't entirely fair. To my knowledge, we were the only two men in that cafe navigating an altered state, while our Dutch opponents were simply enjoying a relaxing afternoon over a few beers. Nevertheless, we thoroughly defeated them. It was the best game of pool I have ever played, even to this day. We laughed, shook hands, thanked them for the games, and drifted back into the streets. By now, we were physically and mentally exhausted. Hours of walking, constant stimulation, and the sheer emotional intensity of the experience had drained every ounce of energy from us. Eventually, we made our way back to the hostel. There, my anonymous American companion and I quietly parted ways. It's strange how certain people can enter your life for only a single day and share such a moment. You never learn their full story, you never see them again. Yet somehow they become inseparable from one of your own memories. I never saw him after that afternoon. I don't even remember his name. But whenever I think of Amsterdam in the summer of 2006, there he is beside me, forever my co-conspirator in that peculiar little adventure through time. One thing I remain grateful for is that we never dared wander into the red light district. Looking back, I suspect it would have transformed the experience into something much darker. The endless procession of lonely, desperate men succumbing to their hedonistic lusts, disappearing through glowing red doorways, the women displayed behind glass like mannequins of sexual merchandise, fulfilling the perverse desires of their customers. That age-old collision between intimacy and commerce would have surely pulled the experience away from wonder and towards something far less beautiful. Instead, Amsterdam had shown me her canals, her bicycles, her flowers, her crooked old houses, her aromas. That is the city I remember. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I lay awake in my bunk listening to travelers whispering in strange languages I couldn't identify from their creaking cheap bunk beds. Somewhere across the room, an old man snored with such determination that he seemed capable of shaking the wooden rafters loose from the building. I simply lay still as a stoned log and listened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, ordinary consciousness had mostly returned. Eventually, I drifted asleep. The next morning, my alarm pulled me back almost entirely into the familiar world. The veil had fallen back into place, but it hadn't completely sealed itself yet. There remained a curious transparency, as though I could still glimpse the other side if I looked carefully enough. I took a taxi to the airport. Somewhere along the journey, I realized I hadn't eaten a proper meal in well over a day. It mattered not. I was still satiated with the events of the previous day and my 2-week European adventure at large. By the time I cleared security and reached my gate, I found myself quietly watching the people around me. Businessmen, families, students, tourists, everyone moving with purpose, with a sense of urgency. Everyone returning to whatever ordinary life awaited them, or arriving home to a normal life in Amsterdam, which, at that moment, seemed like an odd thing to imagine was even possible. And there I sat with what I can only describe as the lingering eyes of the other world. The great adventure was ending. In only a few hours, I would be back in Denver, Colorado, back to conventional America. Yet my mind kept returning to a single question. How could something like the psilocybin mushroom, something that had existed long before human civilization, let alone our own species, be rationally considered criminal in one country while being openly sold in another? How could an organism of nature, a specimen of the earth itself, be arbitrarily prohibited in its use and possession? Why? The simple question enveloped me. I couldn't help wondering whether experiences like this represented, to the powers that be, more than merely disapproved recreational drug use, but an actual threat to their tight grip on power. What if the psychedelic experience posed a genuine challenge to the status quo? Not because it made people irresponsible or violent, but because it encouraged people to question the fragile constructs around them, to examine with unadulterated eyes, removing the rosy-colored spectacles assigned to us in childhood, and to re-examine the world with uninhibited senses of naked wonder, endless possibilities, and new states of consciousness. To peel back the comfortable illusions that modern civilization quietly asks us never to disturb. Money, careers, consumerism, status, endless production, endless consumption, taxes, conformity. Perhaps that is why so many cultures throughout history regarded these plants as sacred, not because they provided answers, but because they demanded better questions, because perhaps this sacrament helped guide our species in its own development and evolution as one organism existing within the greater whole of its environment, an ecological harmony. Again, my thoughts return to the many versions of the story of the lost Garden of Paradise, a timeless myth of mankind falling away from nature and foraging forward into its own destiny as the only animal capable of self-reflection and contemplating the meaning or purpose of life, at least within our known solar system. Perhaps the forbidden fruit was never about disobedience or rebellion against some malevolent, dogmatic deity imagined from mankind's darkest fears and superstitions, born from attempting to explain a natural world that is paradoxically both nourishing and threatening. Perhaps it was always about knowledge, about the true discovery of self, about divine union, about becoming aware of who and what we are. about daring to step beyond the inherited worldview we so easily accept as truth. For one brief afternoon in Amsterdam, it had felt as though I had tasted that bewildering nectar of the forbidden fruit, whose flavor was both sweet and daunting. A reminder that beneath all the machinery of civilization, there still exists an older world, a primordial cosmos of chaos and form whose reality transcends the limited faculties of the human mind and its naturally biased senses. A remembrance that a world exists which refuses to be measured entirely by numbers, reduced entirely to chemistry, or explained away by equations and hypotheses alone. Whether one chooses to interpret that through spirituality, philosophy, psychology, or simply the staggering complexity of consciousness itself, is a journey each individual must undertake alone. I make no claims of possessing ultimate truth, nor that I gained anything which could ever be fully extrapolated and communicated to another person in any language available to us. I only know what I experienced. And how can a direct or mystical experience ever truly be put into words? I do not pretend to know. A voice interrupted my thoughts as the announcement echoed across the terminal, calling passengers to board my flight. I stood, picked up my dusty backpack, and took one last look through the airport windows. My European journey had carried me from the ruins of Rome and Pompeii to the boulevards of Paris, through Brussels, and finally to Amsterdam, the city of canals, bicycles, crooked houses, cannabis, mushrooms, and wandering cats. My wild trip within a journey was finally over. As I boarded the plane and took my seat by the window, all seemed normal again, everything back in its proper place and order. No more visions, no more hallucinatory perceptions. I closed my eyes and quickly drifted to sleep. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, I briefly opened my eyes and looked wearily out the window at the beloved city of canals, of dreams, and of possibilities below. A voice rang out over the intercom, announcing that the flight was on time and that our destination back to the normal world would be reached as scheduled. Bon voyage, Amsterdam.